Welcome to today's conversation, where we take a deep dive into the aspects of creating a more sustainable world. Today, we'll focus on impact investment. In order to soften the catastrophic impacts of climate change, we must transition to a sustainable society that is both fair and green, and that requires money. You're watching Let's Call, a collaboration between Danish sustainability platform Tomorrow and British media, Tortoise media platform. I am Alexandra Musavisere, and I'm a partner at Tortoise Media. And this is where we have the pleasure to call up the change makers in the world and ask them to help us convert our good intentions into real and tangible actions. And we are so honored to have Sir Ronald Cohen, chairman of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment and the Portland Trust, a driving force of impact investment globally, here with us today. And Ronnie, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. And I thought what would be really helpful to frame the conversation and all the questions that we are keen to ask you today is to talk about the journey and the path that has led you to complete the book that you've just published on impact and impact investment, and also what led you to writing that book. So I'd love to hand over to you, Ronnie, and ask you to explain the black background and to where you are today.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's very nice to be in conversation with you about this. And obviously, this is a subject which has come to the mainstream now of public discussion, whether it be at the levels of governments or companies. Or consumers and investors, of course. And so it's a very important time, and there is the opportunity to bring about this impact revolution, which I describe in my book, which is entitled Impact. So what brought me to this was the realization that although I had had the intention to bring societal improvement through venture capital by enabling people who came from nothing to make money and enrich those who work with them, the gap between rich and poor just got bigger and bigger. And when I was still leading APACs in 2000, I got a phone call from the British Treasury asking me to look at poverty and why governments haven't made more progress in fighting poverty. I readily agreed. And I discovered then, Alexandra, that one of the primary reasons why philanthropy had been less successful in achieving its objectives, and governments too, had to do with the fact that investment hadn't gone to support those who want to improve the lives of others. And it set me off on the path of impact investment. And 10 years later, we invented the social impact bond, a security where, as you well know, the return depends on achieving a social improvement, which is measured. The number of prisoners staying out of jail after their release, being, the first social impact bond, the Peterborough bond, as it came to be known. And then, as I worked on the G8 task force, which the UK government asked me to chair in 2013, I began to realize that what the social impact bond had done, which is to balance risk, return, and impact, was actually beginning to happen in the world. You could see it in the ESG investment numbers, environmental, social, and governance investment, which in those days were about $10 billion and today are $30 or $40 billion. You could see it in the values of young people who didn't want to work for companies that did harm or buy their products. And so I began to realize that the optimization of risk, return, impact wasn't just to do with social investment. It was to do with the whole economies, because the climatic and societal problems we face are created not by governments, but by companies. And so if we think of our environmental efforts over the last 4 decades, they've concentrated on governments. And governments aren't able to reduce emissions. Companies have to do so. And if our economic system, in its drive for profit only, creates huge negative externalities, as we call them, for society and for the environment, then we need to change that. And so my book is subtitled Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change, because I really do believe that we have reached a new frontier for capitalism and society, a frontier where companies and investors are measured according to the profit and the impact that they deliver. And technology enables us to measure that impact today so that we can look at the impact from a company's products, its employment and its operations, impacts on the environment and society alike, in monetary terms, and compare them to the company's profit. And so this, in my view, is going to bring an impact revolution that's going to be as extensive and disruptive as the tech revolution.
Thank you, Ronnie. I think if I may, just one of the things that really struck me when reading your book, and if we can dwell on that for a second, is that it's taking sort of the broader sort of purpose, the ideas of purpose and the change that you're talking about, to being actually really concrete about what we need to do from a measurement perspective. As you say, it's not, the governments can't really do so much because the responsibility lies with the companies. And you propose, and you've got some concrete proposals of ways in which that companies can start to look at the way that they report on non-financial metrics. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a bit of a sense of, what are those solutions that you're proposing in the book?
So let me give you a peep into the future, Alexander. If you go to the Harvard Business School site and look for IWA, impact-weighted accounts, you will see that we have published there the environmental damage caused by 1,800 companies, which have published information about metrics, about tons of CO2, liters of water, and so on and so forth. When you look at the numbers in dollar terms, your mind boggles. Of these 1,800 companies, 250 create more damage in a year than profit. 600 create damage equivalent to 25% or more of their profit. Together, they create $3 trillion of damage a year, emphasizing the point we're making about who creates environmental damage. And what's very interesting, and the sign of our times, is that if you look at the market valuation of these companies on the stock market, you realize that it is lower if the company pollutes more. So the 30 to 40 trillion of ESG money that is going to achieve impact as well as profit is tilting the scales in favor of companies that deliver both profit and impact. Now, we can do the same thing on the employment of companies. We can measure their diversity, the differences in pay between gender or ethnic groups, differences in advancement through the echelons of the company. And we can ascribe salary levels to the missing people in terms of the difference in demographics within the company and around its facilities. And so you can begin to look at a company like Apple and say, wow, there's a negative charge for lack of diversity, equal pay, and equal advancement of $2.7 billion to Apple's $10 billion wage bill in the United States. And a company like Costco is doing much better in terms of diversity. It has $1 billion charge. And then we can do the same with product impact. We can look at the fiber content and the sugar content of food companies' products. And science enables us today to value these impacts. You may have seen that the CEO of Danone was just fired by the company under pressure from its shareholders. Well, the board may have looked at the financial numbers very carefully, but was the board aware that Danone's product impact, because of its sugar content, is minus $8 billion versus a profit of 5? Was Faber the right person to bring Danone to positive product impact? Was that considered? And so you can see how in the future we're going to be evaluating the performance of companies, valuing them financially on the basis of both profit and impact.
Thank you. That it's incredibly interesting, and I think that is going to be, as you say in your book, that it's going mainstream, I think, is the way that you talk about it. I'm just wondering if, staying on that topic of the metrics, and looking at the sort of almost a tsunami of capital that is going in the climate direction, and a lot of capital that's coming out of, the reallocation maybe from asset managers that are looking for green companies and green portfolios, but also looking at the big funds that have been set up by the EU and also by the new administration in the US. The Biden team has been very focused on this, and so looking at this capital flow and the role of the green money, as I think is often referred to. And if you could talk to us a little bit about how you're seeing that selection process, and whether there is going to be sort of clusters of excellence, there might be stranded assets, but also from a measurement perspective, the acceleration of the use of of metrics to make this selection with this capital coming in. Your proposal is probably ever more relevant and important today than ever, and so I just wonder if you could comment on the green money.
Sure. Well, the good news, Alexandra, is that as this impact data is increasingly used by investors and shifts the values of companies, regulators have to be involved. They have to ensure orderly markets where every investor has access to price-sensitive information, in this case, impact information. So we're at a stage today where $30 to $40 trillion of investment money, equivalent to about half of professionally managed money in the world, a very significant percentage, is seeking to achieve impact as well as profit, but doesn't have the information to make intelligent decisions, because companies disclose selectively their impact. They ignore the bad impacts and talk up the good ones. And when they publish information, they don't publish it on the same basis. So it makes it very difficult to compare the impact performance of two companies. So we find now regulators like IOSCO, which brings together the world's regulators, the SEC, to which you referred, the new appointees of the Biden administration, people at the EU, all making IFRSF, which is responsible for all financial accounting outside of the US, all making noises about we need transparency on the impacts of companies. And I think because it's price-sensitive information, it's now inevitable that this transparency is going to come. And in my view, it's going to come in the next 3 to 4 years. If you look at what happened of a profit transparency after the crash of 1929, it took 4 years for legislation to be passed in the United States, which introduced generally accepted accounting principles so that every company couldn't just pick its own accounting principles in calculating its profit, and also introduced, incidentally, the use of auditors to verify these numbers. I see no reason why, after the COVID-19 crash, if you like, we shouldn't move at the same speed or even faster. And so it's very encouraging that the Biden administration and the EU are both focusing on this issue. But if I may raise a challenge in the way, Alexandra, while we're on the topic, we mustn't look to what consensus thinks is acceptable. We must look to what is necessary for investors to make the right investment decisions. So there's an effort today to say, well, we should only look at environmental and not social. Well, that's going to lead to the Gilets jaunes phenomenon. You try to make an environmental improvement and you get social backlash. We have to measure both. And then there's an effort that says, well, let's stop at reporting. We'll report tons of carbon. That's not good enough. We have to report every environmental and every social effect, which, as I was saying, and we're doing it at Harvard. If you go to the Harvard site, you'll see it. And we have to turn it into money so that we can compare an environmental and a social impact with the profits of a company and direct our investments where we think is important. So there's a major need today, and this is something every single one of us on this webinar needs to push for our governments to say transparency on the impacts of companies is a human right. As employees, as consumers of their products, as investors in them, we have the right to know the good and the harm that a company is creating. And we need to introduce, as we did with financial accounting in the 30s, impact accounting principles now that give us comparability over the performance figures of companies.
And that I think is exactly where the crux lies, because as you say, there are many measurements of ESG and a lot of different ways to look at the impact and the measurement of climate. But this could be akin to the 1920s, where it took a few years for the standardization of the data to be aligned and to mold onto one set of metrics that people agree on, and for regulators and auditors to map their auditing on, and for companies to respond to in a unified manner. So I'm wondering if you think that with the urgency of the climate issues, and also the urgency actually of all of the ESG aspects, do you think that we might see that alignment and standardization of data take place quicker than it did on the accounting principles back in the 20s? Is one question. The other question I have, which is related, is the response of the businesses themselves, because right now with a sort of quite a fragmented measurement framework, there's MSCI, the rating agencies, there's the CDP, and there's different units in SASB that are looking at measurement frameworks, and businesses may be able to still sort of pick and choose to use the ones that maybe put them in the best light to stand the best chance with investors. And I'm just wondering if you sort of, as we see the landscape becoming more uniform, what you think the reaction will be from businesses and investors.
So on the speed point, it seems to me it should happen faster than in the 30s, but that requires political will. I think governments coming out of COVID are going to be under great pressure to bring this about. Because what this transparency on the impact of companies does is it enables investors to apply pressure on companies to improve their behavior. And this effectively shifts companies from creating problems or aggravating existing problems, which governments have to tax us all to try to remedy, to companies beginning to bring solutions funded by the investors who are bringing capital to them. So I think the speed, because this information is spreading rapidly now, And if there are investors on this webinar, you should keep your eye on the IWA website at HBS, because we're going to be publishing another 700 companies' environmental impact. There'll be 2,500 companies internationally. We're going to be publishing the employment impact of 3,000 companies, and that will be this month, hopefully. And we will be publishing before mid-year the product impact of several hundred companies across a dozen or so different industrial sectors. The more this information gets out and gets used by investors, the greater the pressure on regulators to push for standardized accounting principles and the publication of impact information on a timely basis by every company. That's what we have to aim for. Now, in terms of reactions, 100 company leaders or so can see that this is the future and have got on measuring their impacts now. But the majority of corporate leaders may think that this may end up being the direction of travel, but are very keen not to see their impacts exposed. And so a lot of corporate leaders may end up being reticent about this. The same was true in the 30s. When we talked about applying generally accepted accounting principles, business leaders screamed that you couldn't possibly use the same accounting principles for companies of hugely different sizes and activities. Of course, we know today that this basis of generally accepted accounting principles, which makes comparison possible between companies, and the use of auditors to confirm the veracity of the information is actually the foundation of our $200 trillion or more of, financial market. The same is going to be true with regard to impact transparency. So we're going to have investors, consumers who are voting with their feet by walking away from products of companies that are creating harm, talent in companies which is speaking up to company leadership about the purpose of companies, pushing on one side, and you're going to have some corporations lobbying on the other against this. But governments today are funding the corporate sector more heavily than ever before. And government has the right to make demands of the corporate sector. And if transparency on impact is the way to improve our climate performance and our social performance, in order to tackle the two great challenges of our age, then so be it. Companies will have to fall into line. The burden in terms of publishing information will be reduced by having a single standardized set of numbers instead of multiple demands, which is what's happening now. The monetization of the metrics, tons of carbon into dollars, liters of water into dollars, and so on, will be done by the accounting houses. So it is feasible, it is necessary, and it will happen because of necessity rather than choice.
Thank you, Ronnie. There's just, if we could sort of just dwell on that for a second, because one of the, I'm wondering if you worry about when you look at the whole ESG space and very rightly are pushing for performance and measurement on all of the E and the S and the G side. But do you worry that companies might think about this in terms of needing to prioritize certain aspects first, i.e. climate first, because that's where the most pressure is externally right now, looking at the way that asset managers are reallocating their portfolios? And do you worry about that the S and the G might fall behind? Or do you actually think that maybe because of COVID, that actually the focus is very much squarely on all three aspects of the ESG measurement? I
think it's an interesting question you ask, Alexandra. I think the efforts are going to be everywhere for different reasons. The environmental effects will require financial investment. So companies are going to have to improve their operations. They may have to shift their delivery fleets to electric vehicles. It's going to cost money. When it comes to, and the same is true for product formulations. If you want to arrive at more nutritious products that improve the health of the consumer instead of harming it, that too is going to involve some investment. But in the social area, it has to do with policies. It has to do with practices, not with financial investment, with capital investment. It has to do with your policies on recruiting, with the training that you provide and the reskilling that you bring to your workforce. So they're actually easier to deliver. And it's quite interesting from the Harvard data that today the environmental impacts of companies are broadly very negative, at least for a third of them, very negative. And for most of them, negative, because nobody's cared about it. But the employment impacts are actually net positive because they're bringing jobs, which is a value. And even if there's a charge against that, it doesn't wipe out, unlike the environmental damage wiping out all of the profit. Typically, in the employment area, it doesn't overwhelm the profit. The product impacts are sort of in between. Many companies deliver combinations of good and bad impacts through their product. And so I think for these reasons, we will find companies pushing on the social side because they can make progress a bit faster there with less capital. But the environmental objectives are also going to be, visible. They probably will end up being approved by shareholders at shareholder meetings, and the performance in achieving them is also going to be assessed by shareholders. And so we're shifting to a world where transition plans are going to be the rule for companies for some years. How do we transition to net zero as a company? How much investment is it going to require? It may reduce our profits now, but what's going to be the drop in the value of our company? Look at ExxonMobil, for example, whose share price has fallen by 2/3 in 3 years because it's a big polluter. Is our value going to drop over the next 3 or 4 years as all of this impact data becomes available and we're shown to be creating harm through our different activities? We have to get on with it. And so you will begin to have shareholders engaging with companies on their transition plans. And the companies that refuse to engage, you were alluding to pushback, are going to be, in my view, left behind in the same way that co-companies have been left behind them.
No, I think that is, that's very interesting. And it'll be interesting also to see the ones that are left behind, whether they can actually transition and find the funding, and maybe some of the funding that I guess is being earmarked towards the greening of the economy will also help some of the companies to transition into that are but it'll be interesting to see how that capital gets put to use.
Look at Tesla.
Yeah.
Tesla has caused the whole of the automobile industry to invest heavily in electric vehicles. Why? Because of the competitive pressure. Tesla is worth 5 of its competitors put together. Its share price multiplied 7 times last year. Why? Because consumers want vehicles that don't pollute. And the automobile industry has realized that if it doesn't get together, doesn't get on with the program of shifting from polluting combustion engine vehicles to electric ones, their sales and their profits are going to decline. That's why I say in my book, Impact, that this is like the tech revolution. The disruption that came from Tesla wasn't just technology for technology's sake. It had a mission, it had an impact mission to shift the automobile industry, to shift the vehicles away from polluting. And so the unicorns of the future, as I mentioned in the book, aren't just going to be ventures that become worth $1 billion. The impact unicorns of the future are going to be ventures that are worth $1 billion and improve the lives of 1 billion people.
Exactly. That's the new definition of unicorns that we look forward to seeing unfolding. Ronnie, it's amazing to hear your views on this. There are a couple of final questions that I hope you have time for us to run through. The penultimate question is about, in your book, you remain quite optimistic about reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And one of the things that you point to is actually the movement of youth and the activism that we're seeing in the younger generation. And I'm just wondering if you could just touch upon the role of the young generation in achieving those kinds of unicorns that you lay out so brilliantly here today. And the final question is, because we will be focusing in Copenhagen in September on all of the things that you've laid out today in our conversation, but also about how we as individuals can become more involved in the impact investment move or revolution, as you call it, and how it becomes very relevant to us as individuals and what we can do as individuals and how we can shape and have an impact on impact investing.
Well, on the first point, what I say in the book is that there's no way of achieving the SDGs without impact investment. The only way we can bring the missing 30 trillion is by getting the ESG investment flows now to deliver real impact, because they have the tools to make discriminating choices between companies. And if we do that, I say, the capital flowing to entrepreneurs will have the same effect that venture capital and tech entrepreneurs achieved in terms of the technology revolution. Entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, of whom I see dozens, I was going to say every month, who now have business models whose aim isn't just to make money, but also to deliver a measurable impact in the tech industry, in using artificial intelligence in banking to come up with new digital platforms that charge the vulnerable customers much less than is being charged today. You find it in software companies which are optimizing public transport usage so as to reduce the number of vehicles on the road, match the size of the vehicle to the demand, and so on and so forth. So money is flowing now to entrepreneurs that want to achieve impact because investors, smart investors, realize that it is going to be easier for an impactful company to grow and prosper than for a company that does harm to people and the environment. And now coming to the question of activism, the simplest thing any one of us can do is to stop buying products of companies that are doing harm, or products that are doing harm from companies which may have an okay performance. So we have to become conversant with the information around products and shop accordingly. Within our companies, we have to speak up. To our governments, we have to say we want transparency. We need generally accepted impact principles so that our impact accounting can enable us to know the impact performance of a company. If we can do those three things, then the impact revolution is going to come this decade. It'll lead to legislation in the next 2 or 3 years, and it'll be implemented shortly afterwards.
Thank you, Ronnie. That was brilliant to hear your views and your outlook on these topics. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have had this conversation with you, and I know many people will be tuning in and benefiting and enjoying and buying your book as well after and before hearing your conversation here with us. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for mentioning the book. All of the royalties of impact are going to impact charities. It's the best way of spreading our message. So please do buy it, share it with your teams and your friends, and let's improve understanding of what impact is about.